Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the media and how it influences our self-understanding when it comes to body image, and some of the theoretical mechanisms that have been explored in terms of how seeing something actually influences how we think about ourselves. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the media and what it is. So the media is really referring to methods of mass communication that are reaching lots of different people. And this could be through communicating about news. It could be providing entertainment, education, data. We often see it used to provide promotional messages like advertisements. And the way in which it can be communicated can be film, newspapers, magazines, TVs, mail, telephone, internet. There's a lot of different mechanisms that we currently use to convey information to people. Now, why would we actually use media? I think it's actually important to understand what that draw is. It's something that we seem to be quite attracted to in US society and generally across the world. So we tend to actually kind of trivialize this attraction as being escapism. And there's a certain amount of that in the sense that we seek to escape our everyday existence by exploring other worlds, right? But that's a little bit perhaps failing to capture the complexity and deep value of media for a lot of people. There's a term called scopophilia, which is essentially the idea that we as people have a pleasure or gain pleasure from looking. And this could be from interest, visual interest, from learning, from a range of different sources. It could be erotic elements. It could be a range of different things that attract us and cause us to gravitate towards using media. One of the other virtues of media is that it can provide us with a window into worlds that we don't normally see. So it allows us to learn about other situations, be able to see the world through other people's eyes, come to understand other people's emotions, and see how other people have imagination about the world around them. The other thing that it does that's kind of interesting is that by having this framing through media, it can actually focus our attention onto certain specific ideas, images, or concepts by sort of a curated understanding of what's going on there. So media has the power and opportunity to provide a range of different things for people that they find appealing. Now, we know that bodies are regularly in imagery. In terms of the things that attract us to imagery, very often they are human stories. And we know that this idea of depicting the human body has existed for a very long time. And the way that bodies have been depicted and the types of ideal bodies that are represented have varied substantially across history, from larger voluptuous bodies to, the Greek vases where you have fairly slim, muscular bodies. It varies in terms of gender, in terms of the depictions. And sometimes you even see depictions that are actually really deliberately designed to display quote unquote ideal proportions for a body. Now, today we still have those types of idealizations in our media, where imagery, in this case artistic imagery, in cartooning, for example, tends to display certain types of bodies. So this is a couple of images that were put together by a bulimia organization that was essentially trying to point out the differences between the images that are often displayed and sort of more common body types that exist in society, and trying to present that comparison. Now, we know that imagery tends not to be representative very often in the United States right now of sort of a typical American body. So for male imagery, there tend to be more muscular, wide shoulders, et cetera, in terms of like a more fit, athletic body. For female bodies, they tend to represent slimmer, smaller bodies. There is a range of ways in which bodies are depicted that have implications for how we understand gender and how we understand people and those sort of idealizations of the body. Now, there is an idea that this type of ideal image for a body has become more and more powerful. And this is a picture of mountains and molehills. And the idea here is that it's not that each individual image necessarily will have an impact on people, but that we are experiencing so many images at such a quantity that we're really dealing with mountains here, that it's the overall cultural presence of imagery that's creating a sort of, we're essentially bathed in a certain understanding of how bodies should be. And the idea here is that this magnitude is actually having a substantial social impact. Now, when we think about these images and the industries that produce these images, it's important to note that these industries actually have quite a bit of power. So if we look at overall media and entertainment, it was about a $735 billion industry in 2017. A lot of this, the largest one was film-related images, so home presentation of video and TV being the largest. Box office draw from movies also was quite large, but a bit smaller. Books, video games, and music also multi-billion-dollar industries. So actually a lot of money is going into this in our society. We also see that advertising, images that are geared towards promoting certain products, actually represents a very large industry, about $43 billion per year. Now, to put some of these numbers in perspective, as a nation, we spend about $27 billion on the National Institutes of Health, our main health research agency, and especially from a medical perspective, and the CDC, our main public health agency, gets about $7 billion per year. So this is just a sort of way of thinking about the size of these industries that are involved in creating media for our society. So we also use media quite a bit. There is, Nielsen has done a survey that they do regularly looking at how people use media. And what we find is that in terms of adults over 18, that they actually have a very substantial use of media. Now, the largest among those different components is about 4 hours per day used for television. But we also get a fair amount of use of radio. And then the yellow, orange, and red bars there refer to use of web or apps on either computers, phones, or tablets. So overall, what they're suggesting is that adults use about 11 hours of media per day, roughly. And now they might be multitasking while they're doing it, but that is really a substantial use of media. There's also a lot of exposure to advertisements, and there's an idea that we are exposed increasingly to those advertisements, product placements in our environment. So there's the image of essentially driving down the street and seeing constant billboards. As you walk down the hallway, all the different posters of various different things that are being sold to you, etc. So there has been an increase in that. Some of this data suggests that it's almost increased tenfold since the 1970s to actually about 5,000 media exposures per day. Now, whether it's exactly that number or not, it kind of depends on the source that you look at, but it's a lot. It's a lot that we are exposed to. Now, advertising and media production in general has become increasingly sophisticated. So very often in talks like these, you see these sort of old-fashioned advertisements, which are kind of funny by modern standards. This is, an old advertisement which sort of awkwardly demonstrates how advertisements can be used to create social pressure on people. and essentially manipulate people. And this is an advertisement for toothpaste, which essentially said there's another woman waiting for every man, and she's too smart to have morning mouth. We're not saying that wives simply use confident their husband. If wives simply use Chlorodynt, their husbands will never look at a pretty girl. But we do know that if you use Chlorodynt, your goodbye kiss works for you, not against you, right? So clearly using social pressure to sell a product in a clear way. And in the imagery there, you see the web sort of presumably capturing men in some way or another, right? What I will say about this is increasingly our ability to create advertisements, to create media that affects people it's actually increased. There's a lot of social science research out there to try and understand how to effectively get people to buy products or think about things in certain ways. So it's increasingly data-based. It's increasingly carefully subtle, so you don't necessarily even understand that you're being marketed to. And increasingly, advertisements are targeted to specific populations to make it even more appealing to individuals. Now, the other element to imagery used in advertisements and other sources is that there's a sense that increasingly this imagery is less and less representative of people and sort of typical bodies in society. So this is actually a social marketing advertisement that has been produced by Dove to sort of illustrate the extent to which this occurs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that sort of process at a later point. But I think that's kind of an interesting illustration of the ways in which media may not actually represent a typical body at this point. So let's take a look at that. All right, so what we're seeing here is that there is a process by which somebody's appearance can dramatically be changed using a range of makeup styles and lighting and computer technology so that someone can look entirely different than the actual physical body that they are. And you can see this in a range of different ways. This is one example, but you can see how in many advertisements, people are made up of multiple components to a body. The idea here being that we may have an increasingly unrealistic understanding of the imagery that we're exposed to may be increasingly unrealistic. All right, so given that there's a wide exposure to these images, that these images may present an unrealistic depiction of people, one question might be, how do these messages actually go from being exposed to them to actually having them enter into your head and have an impact? There is sort of this general understanding that there is something that's going on here. And it tends to be viewed in a fairly simplistic way very often, where you can call it essentially the injection model, which is just you get exposed to more things, and the more things you're exposed to, the more of an impact it has on your body image or your mental health in some way or another. Right. So that's, just more exposure, more impact. Right. Well, what we find is that there is some support for the general idea that increasing exposure does have an impact on people. So there's a range of different types of data, survey data, which has some limitations in terms of especially self-report. So people don't always report things accurately, but there's some indications there that more exposure may have an impact on people. There's also experimental data showing that getting different types of images can, especially more unrealistic images, can have a bigger impact on people, and that there can actually, at least in a transient way, have a substantial impact on people's self-esteem and self-image, right? And there's also interview data, which shows that people have real concerns about this and actually are offended by the way in which media is actually impacting in the way that it's typically presented. The other thing that's really interesting that comes out of a lot of this data is that there is some inconsistency, right? So it isn't the case that in all studies at all points in time that there is an impact. It seems like very often subsets of people are impacted, whereas other people don't seem to have as big of an impact or no impact at all, right? So there is a complexity here that is quite interesting in terms of how people interact with this. There's also indications, especially in interviews, that people actually resist these images, that they're critical of these images, and that the idea that people just automatically respond in the injection model to things that are put into our heads that we experience and just automatically interpret it and use them may not actually be an accurate understanding of how people experience imagery. So the point here is that there might be more complex ways of understanding that relationship that's occurring. All right, so I want to go into some different theoretical understandings of how people experience and use imagery. Before I talk about theories, I just want to remind us all of why theories are actually important, why you should pay attention to them. I know that sometimes they can be, in truth, a little bit boring. But the reason that we use theories is that we can see relationships that occur. For example, the overall observation of the injection model, right? That increasing exposure seems to have this general effect. Now, if we see complexity in that, we want to understand why that's occurring. Why is that relationship happening, all right? And we want to be able to explain it by getting that information. And we also want to be able to see if we can predict, based upon different types of sources of information or different types of information, whether or not they will have an impact, right? And the more that we can do that, theories can help us to actually make those predictions and explain why something is occurring. In fact, they also allow us even to use studies to test whether we're actually correct about our theories, right? So increasingly, as we get more information, we can get a better picture of why things actually occur. Now, one major way that we talk about and think about social influences on ourselves, imagery being one of them, media being one of them, is the idea of social construction. And just to remind us what social construction is, it's essentially the idea that we as a society sort of collaboratively create a reality or an understanding of reality, that through observing, talking to other people, seeing how other people understand things, having certain cultural, historical biases, we create an understanding of that reality in terms of, for example, what body sizes or shapes are societally preferred, right? And those can come in the form of beliefs, for example, about body shapes, right? Or they could be about ethical values, or they could help form what we desire, what we see as being ideal for ourselves, or how we understand identities of ourselves and others, right? And forming those identities, sometimes in contrast to others. So this process of social construction is very powerful in terms of explaining what we do and why we do it. So when we're thinking about this power of social construction, I like to sort of remind us about the idea that perhaps this is not something that is easily adjusted or flexible. All right. So very often we think about social things as being something that we can easily shift, whereas things like genetics or biologically determined things as being very hard and fast and immutable, right? But I want to remind us all that socially constructed things can actually be very powerful and permanent. When I'm thinking about biology, which we think as being very immutable, I, for example, have really bad vision. That's genetic. That's from my family. Most of my family has bad vision. I'm legally blind without my contact lenses. But if I put in contact lenses, really that genetics doesn't impact me very much at all, right? So in some senses, that genetic component to things, that natural component to things, actually is far more modifiable than perhaps some social factors that I might have been influenced throughout my history. So people, for example, who are exposed to certain religious ideas from childhood, for example, that can be a very hard thing to shift throughout their lives. And for even people who leave a religion, very often they describe and experience the process of having that religion still be tremendously important to who they are throughout their lifespan. And it's not something that they can easily shake. So the idea here being that social construction of ideas, values, and beliefs can actually be tremendously powerful and maintain themselves throughout one's life. So given that we have this idea of social construction, there's some element of social construction that is not entirely optional. There's an element in which when you don't toe societal norms, there's actually an enforcement process that occurs. And this is because, people's behaviors and beliefs are observed by others. And sometimes you'll get feedback about what you're doing and how other people feel about that. And sometimes that feedback that you get can be minor, simple comments, and sometimes it can be quite extreme. So an example of this that we'll talk about a little bit is a fairly extreme example of disapproval would be putting someone in jail, right? So when we think about societal control and how a society says to somebody, here's something that you can or cannot do, here's how we expect people in a society to behave, there is a case study that is kind of helpful for thinking about this called the Panopticon. And this is an idea or sort of a case study that was created by Jeremy Bentham, but is really popularized by Michel Foucault, who's famous for History of Sexuality and Discipline and Punish and a few other books that really shifted how we think about the ways in which governments and societies control populations. So the Panopticon essentially asks you imagine a prison. And the prison is one where it's designed, there's a central tower, and the tower is looking out on prison cells. And any person in any of those prisons can be observed by someone who's standing in the tower. Now, it imagines that, if you're misbehaving in any sort of way, you will be punished, right? There will be some sort of discipline taken to ensure your compliance with the rules in that prison. Now, what's interesting about this case study is it also asks you to imagine that there is glass, unidirectional glass, one-way glass, so that people in the cells can't tell whether the guards are actually looking at them or not. So the idea here is that people in the cells will actually behave even if there's nobody there to discipline them, right? So in this sense, people are self-disciplining themselves. They're taking these societal expectations and they're making themselves do the things that society wants them to do, even if nobody's looking at them, right? So this is the idea of how societies sort of create power, how governments can create power. Now, it's important to note here that there doesn't actually have to be an actual guard, right? There doesn't have to actually even be an actual government there. When we're talking about social control, it can actually just be sort of society that's creating this. It can be something that is not deliberately created by the man or some specific group. Very often we do point to specific groups, so corporations, for example, or the rich, or, some other group that's trying to manipulate us to do something like that, something or another. But even uncoordinated attempts that come from this social construction, this history of society, can actually be tremendously powerful in this view that we're constantly being watched and that we internalize this compliance to disciplinary efforts. Now, when we think about this, this idea of power and discipline on individuals, there's an idea of biopower, that this isn't just about rules about, not running stoplights. This is also about how we think about health, how we think about risk, and how we think about our bodies and our embodiment. And there's an idea of, health-related or the cosmetic panopticon, where there is a method that society conveys messages to us about how we should behave. And since we don't actually live in a prison, how are we actually being told what to do? Well, one proposal here is that the media, because it's so heavily present in our society, is actually the message. It's the way of saying to us, this is what we're supposed to do. It's the message about what the form of discipline is that we're encountering and we have to respond to. All right. So by looking at that media and seeing who is portrayed, who's represented in that media, and how they're portrayed, who they are, and what sort of symbolism goes along with those different portrayals in terms of what types of discriminatory or non-discriminatory messages are in that imagery, tells us a lot about ourselves and how we should behave. All right. So that's the idea of the panopticon and the media environment in which we are bathed, and how that can actually cause us to actually self-discipline ourselves to have our bodies be a certain way, for example, or envision that as being desirable. So there's a few other ways that we can also think about this in terms of psychology and psychological theories about how people form body image. And, we've talked about that sort of injection model, which is very often how we typically talk about media as just being media is bad and negatively influences our well-being. That simple, one-to-one correlation, right? But there are actually more complex theories that I think get at some really important messages or important ideas about how that complexity works. So one of these things is called social comparison theory. And the idea here is that we as individuals compare ourselves to others. So we want to have accurate understandings of our own abilities and attitudes, right? We want to understand ourselves. And we do that when we can sort of self-evaluate ourselves, create our own understanding about ourselves independent of anything else, which is very often. We actually look to others to try and understand, relevant to others, to try and understand and compare and contrast to understand ourselves and create our own self-understanding. Okay. So in doing so, we do two things. One is we can pursue upward comparisons. So upward comparisons are comparisons to individuals or groups that have desirable traits that we don't have. And these are typically unfavorable comparisons, all right? We can also engage in downward comparisons. So this is when we compare ourselves to people who are lower in terms of social capital for a range of reasons, right? So when we make those upward comparisons, very often we're seeing those individuals that we're comparing ourselves to as being role models or guides to what we should do, right? When we're making downward comparisons, we're building up our own self-esteem by saying, oh, well, at least I'm not that person, right? And this is how we use those comparisons to create our understanding of ourselves and where we fall in evaluating our own traits, right? So the impact of these comparisons really will depend to a large extent on the extent to which a comparison group feels relevant to us. So if you're making a comparison to individuals who you don't really relate to in important ways, well, then those comparisons may not matter too much. So, for example, I'm not a very good musician. I like music. I play around with it every once in a while, but it's not very important to me to be a musician. I don't think about it a lot. So when I see somebody playing music really beautifully, I don't really see that musician as being somebody who I really relate to as being somebody related to myself. And therefore, I don't really compare myself to that musician, right? In other words, that difference, that comparison isn't a very powerful comparison for me, right? Even though there is a very substantial difference in abilities, right? However, there might be my colleagues when it comes to social science research. Well, those are people who are very important to me. And I do think a lot about how they think about their work and how my knowledge levels in that respect, right? So that is something that's very important to me. So the idea here being that there's a whole range of traits that can determine how much you see someone as being comparable to you or not. And if you don't see them as being relevant, well, those differences don't have a whole lot of power. Now, this is important because the way in which media can really influence social comparison theory is that media can distort our understandings of comparison groups, particularly around body image. So the idea here is if we are exposed to enough people in the media who, through various different reasons, where we see as being comparable to us, because they're depicted in a certain way in a movie or in a TV show or whatever, that we can actually, and if we see that over and over again, and that's a major component of our interactions, as we saw, they suggested that adults spend about 11 hours of media exposure per day. That's a lot of exposure, right? That this can actually distort our perceptions of reality so that we start comparing ourselves to people who probably aren't exactly in a reasonable comparison group. Right. And that's the idea of how through social comparison theory, we can actually understand how people could have lack of satisfaction around their bodies. Right. So another one, this should actually be titled self-schema theory. So self-schema theory is the idea that you have a self and that you understand yourself by essentially picking a range of different characteristics or traits that you see as ways of understanding yourself. So one way that you could understand yourself, I just mentioned one way, that a schema for myself. So a schema that's very important to me is my identity as a professor and a researcher. That's something that's very important for the way that I interact with the world. Right? But you could have other things like religion, or you could have your family history, or the sports that you play. A very common way that people understand themselves and schema for interacting with the world is appearance, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the schema, again, is essentially our mental representation of some distinct elements that we see as being ourselves, being our sense of me. And that's formed by viewing yourselves and thinking about yourselves, but it's also formed by how other people react to us, and then our understanding of how other people's values and how they understand the world. So these schemas are essentially mechanisms or tools that we use for understanding new information as it comes in. So when it comes to appearance, for example, when we're viewing new media images about bodies, we could use sort of our appearance schema to view this, to interpret this, especially in terms of understanding ourselves. Now, if you're looking at a documentary, people are going to respond to this differently, right? So some people might be very attuned to the sort of bodies depicted in that documentary, whereas other people might be attuned to the sort of information research component to that documentary. And personality types will differ in terms of the tools or the schemas that they use to interpret and adopt the information that they're exposed to. So for people for whom a primary schema for responding to images in media is appearance, it appears that they are much more susceptible to and vulnerable to media images. So there's data that supports the idea that for people for whom appearance is really important, they actually are much more responsive to positive and negative information that they get from the media. So this is kind of an important way of understanding this and understanding why some people might respond to a certain type of image and other groups of people might be entirely unaffected by that imagery. All right, so let's talk about self-discrepancy theory. So self-discrepancy theory is a psychological theory that envisions three different sort of views of the self. And these views sort of encompass understandings that need to be reconciled with one another. And when those different views of the self are in discordance, when there's a huge difference or discrepancy between them, that they actually create some sort of emotional response or discomfort for an individual. So what are these views of the self? So the first is the actual self. So the actual self is essentially one's perception of your own, who you really are, all right? Now, that perception of actual self may or may not be accurate, but it is your view of who you actually are, right? Then there's the ideal self, and this is the self that you want to be. So you can think about your actual self and you can say, well, I wish I was a little bit more athletic, or I wish I was a little bit more thoughtful about X, Y, or Z, right? And this is your image of who you want to be, all right? And then you have your ought self, and this is your image of who you believe other people want you to be. So who your parents might want you to be, or your partner might want you to be, or who you think society wants you to be, all right? And again, the idea here is that there's a discrepancy. If there's a discrepancy between those factors, it actually causes discomfort. So, and this might happen in different ways. So a difference between the actual self and ideal self might lead to certain types of emotions like depressions or negative views towards the self. Discrepancies between yourself and how you think society wants you to be might cause, for example, social anxiety. So these discrepancies can actually make a substantial difference in how we respond to situations. And media may be a form in which these selves are actually created, or these understandings of selves, the ideal self, the ought self, or the actual self, by sort of essentially social construction. Now, what we do know from this sort of way of thinking about things is when you actually look at people with high discrepancies, it seems like those people, when exposed to various different images of bodies, seem to be more vulnerable to that media, right? In terms of having a negative impact on them. So self-discrepancies may actually be fairly important for understanding this. So these are clearly complex relationships and interactions. What we know from the research is that people respond very differently to media imagery, and there isn't perfect correlations between. There's an overall general correlation between media and body image challenges, but it doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't happen perfectly, and it doesn't happen for all groups of people. So what these different models do is they help us to understand what's going on in these situations. The other thing is it doesn't only explain why there might be negative impacts from media. It also gives us some suggestions as to how we might have positive impacts on people's well-being, right? So when we're thinking about social comparison theory, well, maybe a possible intervention is to help people to correctly identify groups of relevant people, or shift how people determine relevance of people that they compare themselves to, right? For self-schema theory, maybe the idea is helping build up people's schemas around their identity as something that doesn't relate to their physical appearance. It might be their schema of their worth in terms of their role as a caring community member, for example, right? So how can we help people to view themselves in different ways, use different information processing approaches, right? And then for self-discrepancy theory, the idea here is, can we do something to shift how media is actually allowing for the creation of those different views of oneself, so that there's less discomfort and discrepancy between them for an individual? So these theories can actually be useful when we're thinking about designing interventions to help people deal with possible body image issues. All right, so that's a basic summary of some of the theories and ways that we think about bodies and body images, how we think about the social construction of that within the society, and really how powerful the image, the industries are that creates these images and media in terms of their presence in our lives. And of course, again, providing some clues to us as to why people might be impacted. So thank you very much for listening, and take care, everyone.